Okay.
Yep.
Well, first I ought to introduce myself, because if you're under 60 years of age, you probably never heard of me. But I, you know, for some years, about 25 years, I was a technical editor of Diver magazine. Okay, so I actually got paid. Now I'm showing you this picture, which I took in the Chikuzen in BVI. There's a wreck of a refrigerator ship, where I snuck in and took a picture of this grouper. Because while I was in BVI, while I was in BVI, of course, I was, if you've dived the wreck of the Rhone, for example, I was trying to take a picture of a lobster during a night dive, having great difficulty. When this lobster strolled by behind me, this lobster, it's hard to tell with a lobster, but this was about 1 meter long and was a character on the wreck of the Rhone, and was known as Lobzilla, for any of you who have dived it. I'm sure you'll know it, you have. And the Rhone, of course, is the wreck that they used as the location when they shot The Deep, the movie The Deep. Was all the underwater sequences were shot on the wreck of the Rhone. Why I brought these pictures in to begin with is because on this particular trip to BVI, I met Mauricio Handler. And Mauricio Handler was a National Geographic photographer. He started off as assistant to David Duvallay, and quite frankly, he was a much better photographer than me. And I really appreciated being on the boat with him and seeing what a great photographer he was. But every time I met Mauricio on events after that, at places like the Dima show or wherever we were, he always introduced me to his friends as the only person he knew who made a living out of underwater photography. And I'm going to tell you how that came about. But it all started quite a long time ago. When I was a kid, I was mad on trains. Oh, sorry, I should say that I've taken so many pictures. I've started to recognize, I should say, fishes in other people's pictures. You know, I mean, I see this group of fish and I think, oh yeah, I know them. They're on Cape Cree and Rajarampat. I know this group, and I see them often photographed, and I think, God, I'm starting to get to know the fishes from their pictures. It's really sad. Anyway, when I was a kid, I was mad keen on trains. And when I say I was mad keen on trains, in those days, of course, trains were not sort of these things that hum by now. These things spat fire, they hissed steam, they belched smoke. They were really exciting. And I used to spend my childhood down at Oakley Park Station waiting for these trains to come by. And of course, my brother had a box camera, which I borrowed, and I tried to take pictures of them, very unsuccessfully. This is not one of my pictures, I hasten to add. My pictures were pathetic because a little box camera, of course, was hopeless trying to photograph something moving at high speed. So I'd go to King's Cross Station where I photographed things like this, the mallard. And I photographed these. These were my favorites, the A4 Pacifics. You know, there was the mallard, the silver link, the Sir Nigel Gresley, and even one named after Sir Justin Beaver, I believe. He'll tell you more about that later. So I was photographing at the age of about 11. I was a mad keen photographer. But of course that didn't last. And I went to school and I wanted to be a photographer. I was desperate to be a photographer. And I managed to wangle my way onto a degree course when I was only 16 years of age. And I was leaving school and I went to this rather it was a public grammar school. It wasn't a public school, it was a grammar school, but it pretended to be a public school. And I remember the headmaster, I was dragged into the headmaster's office when I was leaving at 16. He took it as a personal affront that anyone would leave his school at 16. And I remember him saying to me, "Bantin, do you want to end up like Putnam?" And this guy, Putnam, had been a few years before me. He'd done the same. He'd left at 16 as well. If only I'd known he was to become Lord Putnam, the doyen of the film industry. But there we are. That's what happens in life. I had a passion for photography. So that's how it all started. And eventually I found I had a few wrong turns, but eventually I found myself assisting an advertising photographer in London. And suddenly the world opened up to me. And after a few years, I got to the age of about 23, I think it was, and I decided to go and try and work for myself and get advertising commissions from myself. And I struggled really hard, and it was very difficult because nobody trusted me with these big budgets. And the only person who trusted me at the beginning was a guy called Derek Burton, who was the art editor of Penthouse magazine. So I spent a year taking photographs of things that I'm not going to show you now, but most young men of that age only dreamt about. But later on, that experience allowed me to get into advertising, and I did this ad for the War Secretariat, or this ad was for Fiorucci, or this ad was for Armstrong car parts. So I started off with my experience of photographing flesh was my road in to advertising. But eventually things started to take off, and this was a Guinness Poster I did. This was the beginning of my career, really. This was Guinness Poster. We photographed the bottles on dendritic salt, made a set in the studio, and of course the background, the mountains, they were all retouched in. But I did loads of these Guinness posters, and of course there were big budgets. You know, we shot this one at South Cairn Underground Station one night. I photographed all the tankards of Guinness as they went down the escalator, and then we lit the whole thing and got in there, and that was a poster. But in fact, that poster actually never saw the light of day because it bombed out in research. But this was one I did for eggs. I'm going to quickly show you the sort of things I was doing. This was for eggs. I did a whole series of these. The famous celebrities who were in these, of sporting personalities in these posters, have all been forgotten now. People probably don't even know who Duncan Goodhue was. But in those days, we were shooting on film. So, for example, something like this, which is just 5 pints of beer, we had to get 5 pints of beer lit in front of the camera, all exactly right. It wasn't a question of today with digital photography, you shoot one and then duplicate it. These had to be got in the camera. So that was the whole skill of being a photographer in those days, was getting it right in front of the camera. And this meant a lot of ingenuity and resourcefulness, you know. Now, today, and this is the sort of thing they cobbled together from library shots. But in those days, we went out to the Caribbean, we chartered the schooner, which was $1,500 a day, I remember, and we had to find a location where we could find this shallow turquoise water with a drop-off so that we could get the schooner close up to, and we went and shot it for real. And this picture, you know, had a budget of about £20,000. So there was a question of a lot of trust was involved that you get the shot right. But of course, if I came back without the pictures, it was my £20,000. I only got paid on results. So I negotiated these things. Now, as a downside to this trip, we had to wait for weather. And I was in Antigua, in the Caribbean, waiting for weather. So what do? You know, there's only so much conch chowder you can eat, only so many conch fritters you can eat, only so much pool you can play. So I saw this sign over this hut that said, "Learn to scuba dive here." So I went and learned to scuba dive from these 2 German guys, you know, who taught me to scuba dive and gave me a certificate at the end, which had Verband Deutsche Taucherlehrerin on it. And that was it. And I never realized that this was going to be my downfall. This was going to be the horrible thing that was going to ruin my career as a successful photographer. So anyway, getting back to photography, you know, I'd go off to somewhere like, we shot this at Barcelona airport. We had to put it all together. I put this all together in Spanish, not my natural language, but I had to get together the casting, the taxis, the cars, and so on. This is all needed to be put together in front of the camera. The last thing you needed to know really was what the exposure was going to be. You know, that was a given really, that you'd be able to get all that right, because we're shooting on film, don't forget. So this one, for example, the Science Museum was very happy to send me over Buzz Aldrin's spacesuit to my studio, but unfortunately the Tower of London wouldn't let go of King Henry VIII's suit of armour because it was worth £20 million, and they didn't feel comfortable putting it in a taxi. So we went to the Tower of London and got locked in. We built a studio in the Tower of London and got locked in overnight. So you're seeing someone who's actually been locked in the Tower of London. In fact, we did 2 shoots at the Tower of London. I've been locked in the Tower of London overnight twice in my life. This is a picture. This looks like a pretty innocuous picture of a girl leaving an office late at night. In fact, the girl in the picture is Heather Mills with two legs. You know, Heather Mills, the one-legged girl who later married Paul McCartney. She's a bit younger then. But just to give you an idea of what goes into these photographs, it's a very boring looking photograph, but here's a picture of it a bit earlier in the production. That's me. You can see that before we took the photograph, we had to build the contents of the photograph, as well as the lighting. You can probably see a bit of glimpse of the sort of lighting setup above there, because we used to use about 20,000 joules of lighting on a shot. Nowadays, your underwater flash gun is probably about 40 joules, just to put it in perspective. Another one, you know, they wanted me to photograph some nurses with some newborn quadruplets. Where do you get newborn quadruplets from? We went and sat at the Royal Free Hospital for a week until 4 similar babies were born at the same time. They weren't actually quadruplets, but they pretended to be. So we had that. Every time we got an idea, we were given the idea, we had to find a way of making it come to real life, as it were, before we took the photograph. This is a picture I took in the ballet school that's in Richmond Park, White Lodge Ballet School. We went in there, we took out the rails, put in a few, put in the fireplace and a bit of set building in the foreground, and we shot that there. Now, this was something I did with cats. I did a lot of stuff with whiskers. Now, interestingly enough, in 1984, I decided to embark on the BSAC club diver and club instructor and advanced instructor course. And they did the first one down in Spain. And everybody went by motor coach down to Spain to Astarte to do this 2-week course. So we're on the bus. I incidentally didn't pack any scuba gear on the bus. Everybody else turned up at King's Cross with their scuba gear. I planned to rent mine when I got there. I actually put a compressor on the bus because I was smuggling a compressor into Spain for my house in Spain. So we went down to Spain on this bus, and on the way down the Old Kent Road, you know, the A2 towards Dover, we started introducing ourselves to each other, and people would inevitably said to me, "So what do you do for a living?" And I say, "Well, look out the window, see that poster for Whiskers Cat Food? I did that. And see that poster for Cadbury's Dairy Milk? I did that. And see that poster for Hague Whiskey? I did that." And they looked at me, and they obviously thought I was the biggest bullshitter they'd ever met. No one believed a word of it. And of course, bullshitting is what you have to be good at if you want to get these big contracts, because no one is going to give you a contract worth big bucks if you're not very confident. I mean, even a picture like this, you know, we shot down to Marbella. I knew Tony Darley's restaurant had a nice location. We shot down there and put it together in a couple of days and came back. And of course, you're getting paid big bucks for that. But you had to be ingenious. You know, this was a difficult one to do. I had to really think this one out because I had to make this work. This was not photoshopped. This was shot for real in the camera. Here's another similar one. And you have to think, how are you going to do this? How are you going to make it all work? And you have to come up with an ingenious way of doing it. I won't bore you with the details. I mean, this one, we went off to the Seychelles, to La Digue in the Seychelles, and I found a guy who had a Land Rover. La Digue had no motor traffic in those days, but there was one guy on there, Marston his name was, who had a Land Rover, which we adapted. And of course, the hummingbird, where do you get hummingbird from? I went to the Natural History Museum at Tring, where I found a guy who was cataloguing thousands of hummingbirds. And I went down there and I smooth talked him and borrowed a hummingbird from him, which I took off on holiday to La Digue in the Seychelles. It was on a tungsten wire, and the wind was making its wings flap. And that's how we got that shot. So, you know, they're pretty boring shots, but they take a lot of putting together. It's the actual getting the exposure right and getting it well lit and pressing the button at the right moment is just really the last thing you're thinking about. It's getting it all together in front of the camera. Now, this is a shot I took in Glen Etive. This was the most expensive single photograph I ever took. This picture cost the best part of £40,000 to take, because I didn't drive around Scotland looking for a herd of horses that happened to be there. I took the horses with me, and every horse has a handler. Every handler has a hotel room. So you can imagine there's a big production involved. And incidentally, each one of these horses was famous from being a film horse in its own right. The white horse that you see in the middle, that was the same horse that plunged out of the wardrobe at the beginning of the Time Bandits film. So, it cost a lot of money. In fact, I actually ended up giving the horse master, David Goody, the horse master who'd done for example, he'd done the Charge of the Light Brigade. I ended up giving him £20,000 in used notes in the back of a horse truck. And he very kindly wrote me a receipt on a piece of toilet paper, which, believe it or not, the Inland Revenue accepted. Anyway, that's the thing. Now, this was my first shark picture, which was in the Radio Times on the first night that Jaws was shown. And of course, the toucan was the symbol of takeaway sales for Guinness. So there we are. Anyway, all this, of course, generated an awful lot of money, and it enabled me to buy a house in Mallorca. And I wanted to go diving, so I got myself a dive boat, and I'd smuggled a compressor into Spain in the BSAC bus, for example. So I used to have my friends, and I was a member of Hove and Dive Club, and we used to go diving around Mallorca. And while I was there, I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a book on snorkeling. I thought it's a great idea of doing a book, an instructional book on snorkeling, but there was a slight twist to it. And one of the commissioning editors I approached afterwards, trying to get it published, said to me, "This is nothing more than a thinly disguised excuse to show naked girls in exotic locations." I thought, well, at least she understood the idea. But I couldn't get anyone to publish it. But I've still got the pictures, and they haven't dated at all. Then I had this idea that nobody at that time, this was 1989, you can't believe it, but nobody had made a video about how to dive. And a production company was making fishing videos. They approached me about doing a diving video, and I thought that would be a good idea. I could do that. I could shoot it all outside my house using my facilities in Mallorca. And all I needed was to somehow find some way of marketing it. And I did a deal with Diver magazine, and there's the video, and we marketed it, and we sold many thousands of copies all around the world. We sold it in both NTSC as well as PAL, and it was incredibly successful, and it made a profit, which was worth doing. So I thought, well, let's do another video. Let's do one that's aimed not so much at people who want to learn to dive, but people who are already diving. And I did this video, and it was aimed at divers, and we sold 700 copies, and it was a dismal failure. The first diver video, I think, cost me £10,500 and made a profit. The second diver video cost me £32,000 and made a huge loss. And now what did I learn from that? Don't get involved in diving. Anyway, that was the diver video. So in 1992, I'd made enough money, and I'd got a bit burnt out. I was getting burnt out. By then I was 45 years old. Art directors I was working with were in their 20s. There was this age gap approaching. I was thinking, well, I've got to do something else now. And I'd been a passenger on this boat, the Lady Jenny 5, many times. And the owner, Tony Turner, said he was prepared to sell it to me. So, I didn't really know. I mean, I went diving on it as a passenger, but I didn't know about running it as a business. So I said to Tony, why don't I take the job as a dive guide on the Jenny 5 for 6 months so I can learn about the business, and then, maybe I'll buy it from you. So I went off on this boat. We went from Sharm, the whole length of the Red Sea, Sharm, down through Egypt, down to Sudan, down to Eritrea, across to Hodeidah in the Yemen, down to Djibouti. So we covered 1,500 miles of the Red Sea, dived in, did some fantastic diving, but I found out within 6 days of being on board that this was not a business to get into. I could see this was a big hole in which to lose money. That's the liveaboard business. But here we are. This is a picture I took in the Umbria on that trip. I took this on a Nikonos 5 with a 15mm lens, and inside the Umbria. And many years later, I went back with a digital camera and I shot the same picture. And in terms of quality, not a lot of difference. So that's quite interesting, I think. While we were on this trip, on the way back, we found out about a wreck that a guy called Shimshon Micaiah had been taking angling charters to. He was an Israeli, and he'd been doing angling charters to this wreck. And he told us about it, and nobody really dived it. This is 1992, because he just said there were a lot of fish there. That's why he was an Israeli, had a boat called the Sun Boat, did these angling charters. So we went to look at this wreck, and blow me, well, you all know which wreck it was. And we were diving that, and we kept it secret for about 6 months. Nobody knew about it, but by about 1990, well, about May of the following year, 1993, some Italians had published an article in an Italian magazine. So I published an article about it in Diver magazine, and the rest is history. All I can tell you is when we first dived it, the toolkits were still under where the saddles of the bikes had been. You know, everything was still virtually complete. The steering wheels were all complete on the trucks. It was beautiful. And the wreck was covered in soft coral. There were masses of groupers that roosted under the stern at night. There were barracuda, there were black-tip lembatus, black-tip reef sharks swimming around it. It was a brilliant dive. But unfortunately, of course, like all these things in life, once it gets popular, it gets spoiled, you know. But it's still a good dive, still a fantastic dive. It will never be the dive it was in 1992, I'm afraid. But isn't that the same with everything? Isn't that the same? They should never have let sex go to poor people, because once poor people got their hands on it, they ruined it, you know. So anyway, I got this job at Diver magazine. Now, how did I get the job at Diver magazine? Well, it's curious, really, because when we did these diving videos, it was a joint venture between the production company, me, and Diver magazine. And there seemed to be a bit of a problem, because when I got back, the production company who were sending out the videos said they weren't receiving any cash, because there seemed to be a hold up somewhere along the line. Diver magazine was receiving the cash, the production company was sending out the videos, but there seemed to be a blockage somewhere that the money wasn't being passed across. And so I went and approached Bernard Eaton. I didn't really know the Eatons very well in those days. I went and approached him and I said, "What's going on?" And then he said, "Oh, it hasn't made any money." I said, "No, hang on, it's a joint venture. You collected the money, we did the expenses, you know. So you're meant to give us 2/3 of the money." He said, "Well, blah, blah, blah." Anyway, the upshot was that my accountant pointed out to him that being a joint venture, it could be a case of fraud if the money went missing. And I got invited into Diver to go through their books to identify all the money that should have gone to the production company and to me, which I did. Now, while I was doing that, and it's curious, I was invited in, and I went through Diver magazine's books, or Eaton Publications books, with their bookkeeper. And I discovered that the bookkeeper was working this incredible VAT fraud. Just a little thing I noticed, you see. So when I mentioned this to Bernard Eaton, there was a lot of shock, because they didn't think they knew anything about it. So anyway, I'd gone away on the Jenny 5 and come back, and they were so grateful to me to having discovered that there was this fraud going on, this VAT fraud, that they offered me a consultancy, and I started working for Diver. And you have to remember, in those days we were shooting on film, and I could take a picture underwater, just like I could take a picture on land. You know, I could take it and get the exposure right and get it in focus, and maybe light it quite nicely. I can do that with, you know, like falling off a log, because it's been something I've been doing for the previous 25 years or more. you know, and with a lot of responsibility, because remember, on an advertising shoot, if you've got a budget of £20,000 and the shoot goes wrong, it's your £20,000. So you're quite focused on getting the exposure right and getting getting it in focus. You know, it's something you do as a matter of course. So I got this job, and this is a page out of Diver, for example, illustrating an article about free flow. And of course, I wrote the words as well. But to be honest, I never went there as a writer. But you know, you can change words. Photographs are hard to change, especially in the days of film. You know, you're rather stuck with it. And of course, it turned out that Diver magazine avoided using underwater pictures in those days. You can't believe it, really. A diving magazine avoided using underwater pictures because they were very hard to get hold of, and people would go off and take pictures on holiday or on a trip, and they'd shoot reams and reams of film, and maybe 2 or 3 shots were okay. You know, I mean, do you remember those little yellow cameras, those Motorine 2s? I don't know why people even bothered to buy them, because very, very few people ever got any satisfactory pictures out of them. They were full of expectation and not a lot of result, unfortunately, because it was just very, very difficult to do unless you had a great understanding of wet film photography. So you'll notice, this was a picture I took to illustrate a feature on masks. You'll notice in a lot of my pictures that my subject matter is set to one side, because of course I'm always considering the fact that there's a layout. There's a layout which involves type, words, and you know, I've got to shoot allowing for the fact there's going to be some body copy that's got to go on the page, and I've got to think about where the staples go, because in those days Diver magazine was a stitched magazine, not a perfect bound magazine. So you had to think about that. So as you'll see, a lot of my pictures are over to one side. Then of course I started doing other things, like for example, I started writing about diving equipment, and I got sent this regulator from a really dodgy Lancashire manufacturer, you know, small engineering company who'd made a regulator before, which was really a pretty awful regulator. So I thought, how can I demonstrate how bad this regulator is that they make? So I decided to put 4 divers on the same regulator, 4 second stages on the same first stage, and go down a line to see how deep we could go before the regulator failed. Blow me, we got down to the seabed at 50 meters, and this regulator was performing better than the individual diver's own regulators at 50 meters. And of course, that regulator was an Apex regulator. Ken Ainscough sold his company to his company was Apex, sold it to Aqualung, and sailed off into the sunset on his yacht, went to live in Australia, and the rest is history. You know, nowadays everyone thinks Apex are the mutts, you know, the bulldogs bollocks, as it were. You know, the best, the mutts nuts, as it were, in terms of regulators. But in those days, when I first did this test, no one had actually done this, you know. So this started a whole series of regulator tests where we did the same thing. We took groups of divers diving down past 50 meters. We always did in excess of 50 meters, and breathed off the regulators and got these divers to make notes. And people would say, oh, well, they must have been out there, knocked out their heads. I always chose divers who are used to diving deep. That's the first thing. And they made notes that all corresponded. They made notes at depth. They all corresponded. There was no sign of any nitrogen narcosis, you know, or if there was, they were all amazingly narked in exactly the same way. So we did loads of these tests. And of course, I had to take the photograph, and the photographs had to come out. That's very important. It's no good going in and say, oh, sorry, we didn't get a result. So my pictures were not exhibition pictures. They weren't competition pictures. They were just pictures that fulfilled a function. You know, and of course I got into terrible trouble because sometimes I slagged off some piece of equipment. This was Typhoon have never really forgiven me for this, because I actually reviewed this Ranger's suit and said it was so much better than their previous suit, which was like a tea bag. And of course, from then on, the Typhoon suits got christened tea bag by everybody. And Peter Bibby, who bought Typhoon, always blamed me for that. But you know, I had to take a picture, for example, for a fin review. I had to take some pictures of some fins. Uh, so every year you started doing the same, virtually the same article again, but in a different way. So you had to think of a different way of doing it. And of course, the pictures had to come out. You know, I did comparison tests of computers, for example, where I took them all down side by side. We did this on the Rosalie Muller. We go down to the seabed, get them all into deco mode, and did comparisons of what they said on the way up. But again, I had to take photographs of all the displays so I could remember what was going on. It's no good trying to remember it afterwards. I had to photograph the displays of all the computers at all different depths so I could examine the pictures afterwards. And of course, I also had to take a picture that illustrated what we were doing. I sometimes got other people to help me on these tests. This is Chris Boardman, who I dragged in to help me review a winder reel, which was slightly unusual. Here he is again, Chris Boardman. I did a comparison of underwater scooters. I did this in Cape and Ray. So, you know, the important thing is the pictures have to come out. And of course, taking pictures on the surface, it's obviously easier, but they've got to be right. They've got to do the job. And of course, you know, my Penthouse magazine training was always there in the background. I always knew how to get a bit of flesh nicely lit. And sometimes, of course, I was short of a model, so I appeared in the pictures myself. And of course, that's how people got to be really sick of seeing me on the pages of Diver magazine. But I had to set these pictures up in such a way that I could get someone to press the button and go and stand in and get the shot. I took this at the very early days of nitrox, and I wanted to photograph something illustrating nitrox, and it was a picture I took, and my wife did a lot of modeling for me in those days. And of course, there's that picture which has been overused by everybody now of people jumping in the water. I took this picture of my wife. It's a bit funny color, unfortunately. This was shot on film, obviously. I took her in Grand Cayman. We were doing an ad for CNC cameras. And of course, how did I get stingrays to get around her? Well, of course, I packed her pockets of her BC with dead fish just to make it more interesting. I went to the Solomon Islands. Now, on the way out to the Solomon Islands, it's quite a flight. You know, you fly to Los Angeles, then to Fiji, then on to Honiara. On the way out, I sat next to this other guy, and we got chatting on the phone. And he was working for another magazine, and I said to him, "Oh, what do you normally do for a living?" "I'm a professional photographer." And he pulled out, he had the Nikonos RS, he had fantastic equipment. Fantastic, I have to say this, beautiful stuff. And I was just got a couple of Nikonos 5s and 15mm lenses. And I felt very underprivileged. But luckily, none of his pictures seemed to come out very well. But that's another story. I went on this boat to Aldabra. You don't often get to Aldabra. It's very hard to get there now. This boat was unfortunately captured by Somali pirates shortly after, so that won't be going to Aldabra anymore. But I did some great trips, and I had some great adventures. For example, you know, I was one of the first people to be certified on a Draeger rebreather. You'll notice it didn't have a BC in those days, and this is actually Michelle Cove, Stuart Cove's wife at the time, that was a sort of early days of rebreather. It was only a semi-closed rebreather, but later on I was using the prototype of the Inspiration, and eventually I went out to the Maldives with Martin Parker, where I did a dive. We did quite a deep dive. It was 55 meters deep. The shot of the computer over there on the right that I did, and we got separated. We were trying to photograph these hammerheads at Hammerhead Point, Rasdu, and we got separated. And blow me, afterwards I looked at my computer, because we didn't have closed circuit computers in those days. We only had at the usual Aladdin, and we set them at sort of air, really, for the depth of the mixer at the deepest depth we were going to go to. And I looked at my computer, I noticed that I had, well, it said 88 minutes of stops. So, oh, blood, 88 minutes of stops, that's a lot. Well, I thought I've got enough gas, I can do that. And I went over to the first stop, which was at 30 meters, and that's when I realized that the time to surface on the Aladdin was only 2 digits, but actually it was 188 minutes. So it was quite a long ascent, really. And I came up, and I still had 55 minutes to go at 6 meters when Martin came by in the Donny and dropped his Aladdin down to me on a rope that said SOS. And he was telling me, don't worry about trying to do the deco. It doesn't matter because we're on closed circuit now. But we really didn't know. And so I came up and felt very insecure and insisted on doing a deco dive later. But they were very early days. That's one of the first 2 inspirations ever, or production models of the inspiration ever made. I couldn't find a photograph of the pre-production models, but there we are. But then, of course, Martin gave me an inspiration, which I took out of Cocos. And no one on the boat had a rebreather. No one had closed circuit. And I managed to do a Bantin, as they say in the evidently in the closed circuit world of training, because I jumped in the water on one dive. There was a whale shark below me. I swam down to it. I thought I switched the set point over because in those days, it was manually set. The switch point was manually set, or the set point, I should say, was manually switched. Let's get it right. And I didn't switch over to the high set point, and I did the whole dive at a set point of 0.7 bar, which meant I would have been severely bent if I'd come up. It was only when I switched back that I noticed, or went to switch back, I noticed I'd done the whole dive at the wrong set point, and then had to swim off and do a deco dive for an hour at 6 meters. But you can do that on a rebreather, and I'm told that lots of people made that same mistake after, which is why they very quickly introduced automatic set point switching on rebreathers, because that was a mistake just waiting to happen, wasn't it? I was a bit of a guinea pig, really. I thought I was one of these, privileged, trusted people, but in fact, I was just a guinea pig. I went off with a Sentinel rebreather and did some dives. Now that's a picture of me with the Sentinel, and I'd set that up, and I had my dive buddy was set in position, and all he had to do was press the button. And people said to me, "You went off with the Sentinel rebreather for a week, and it never broke down. It never went wrong." I said, "Yeah." They said, "Wow, that's amazing." I said, "I had a special accessory in my cabin." They said, "What was that?" I said, "Kevin Gurr," because I went with Kevin Gurr, the guy who invented the Sentinel, and that's why my Sentinel never went wrong, but a lot of others people's did. But here I am. This is on a JJ rebreather. Again, I'd set someone up. That's with Dave Thompson, and we were using the JJ rebreather, So we did a lot of different dives with different bits of kit. Rebreathers are very useful for doing things like this sort of shot. I was hiding among the rocks in Dirty Rock in Cocos and getting shots of these Galapagos sharks, which are quite hard to photograph really at times because they're very timid. But because a rebreather doesn't give off any air bubbles, you can actually hide behind a rock. I mean, you're not invisible. Don't kid yourself. You don't become invisible wearing a rebreather, but it does give you the option to hide and ambush things. Early days, I was diving with Rob Palmer using Trimix. We did a dive to 120 meters deep at Rassam Sid. And would you like to see my Trimix certificate? You can't, because I haven't got one. Because in those days, we were ahead of people giving out certificates. So we did this dive. That's Rob Palmer. Did a lot of dives with him. And I was doing dives as a journalist and going, yeah, okay, tell me what I need to know. And I go off and do it. So I wouldn't recommend it. This is me inside a Bahamas blue hole with Steffi Schwaber. I mean, cave diving is something that is not recommended to anybody unless you've been formally trained. But there we are. Here I am. I'm still here, still alive and kicking. You've got to just be very sensible about these things. But I never had any cave diving certification. Yes, and we're using side mounts as well. I didn't have a side mount diving certification. Years later, I did the first PADI side mount course with David Jones, and it was quite funny, really. I said, "Oh, it's like diving with 4 tanks, but only having 2 tanks." He said, "Don't start." So there we go. It's quite hard being the first of anything because other people very quickly come along behind you and do a better job. This is Jeremy Stafford Deitch and I. Jeremy had discovered a place in the Bahamas where bull sharks aggregated, and we went there and snorkeled with them, and it was great. And we were taking rolls and rolls around the Conus Fives of these bull sharks, and we thought, well, what we need to do is we need to get out a shark expert, and we got out Dr. Eric Ritter as a shark expert. There he is with 2 legs. But he became very proprietorial, and suddenly he sort of took over and they became his bull sharks. It's very odd thing how people become proprietorial about things, you know. I mean, I never became proprietorial about the thistlegorm because I knew that once everybody else started diving it, the game's up, isn't it? That's how it is. And it's the same with Walker's Key. You know, people went out and dived with these bull sharks. Loads of people dived with them, probably took better pictures of them than I did as well. You know, it's like I went to Cocos and we were doing these night dives with the white-tip reef sharks, you know, which were quite frenetic. And eventually, of course, everybody was going out there and doing it. And that's what happens. You know, you can't claim ownership of something. You just go, oh, well, it's good. You know, it's good to be first, but you know that there are loads of people going to come behind you, especially if you publish an article about it in a diving magazine. So we did that. I understand after a time they had to stop doing these night dives because the sharks started getting overexcited about divers. So you know, in those days, you'd go in the water and you just have the whole seabed heaving with these white-tip reef sharks hunting in complete chaos. But nobody got hurt. But I think the moment somebody lost control of their buoyancy and put their hand in amongst the feeding sharks, it was obviously going to be mischief was going to occur. You know, I took pictures of oceanic white-tip sharks way back in the day, but of course everybody does it now because you know, everyone's learned where they are. It's going to be the case, isn't it? I did this piece on Michelle Cove called Wonder Woman because she was feeding sharks, and I wanted to get a shot of Michelle with lots of Caribbean reef sharks. So we went out to a place, Shark Reef, to do this. And of course, as I say, I used to write about diving equipment at the same time. And I used to use the diving equipment when I was doing these other projects. And I had an atomic regulator, very expensive regulator, you know, more than £1,000 for a regulator in those days. That was saying something. And I had this atomic regulator, and it had been to another magazine. Unbeknown to me, the editor of that other magazine had taken it apart and reassembled it incorrectly. So I was swimming along with this atomic regulator in my mouth, breathing off it, swimming backwards with my camera. Stuart Cove was free baiting the water behind me, and I was swimming and pushing sharks out of the way with my head virtually, and Michelle swam along and we took the pictures. And suddenly the diaphragm of this atomic regulator collapsed inwards. At which point I really wished I'd had an octopus rig. But there we are. So yes, it wasn't the sharks that were dangerous. This is what I'm getting at. You're more likely to drown from a regulator going wrong than you are to be eaten by a shark. But the great thing about Stuart Coves, you know, you always get good shark close-ups there, but it always involves some dead fish because they're not going to come round and be close to the camera for any other reason. I mean, oceanic whitetips come close to the camera because they are ocean roving predators or scavenging and looking for anything in the open, in the blue, whereas reef sharks know exactly what they eat, and you've got to have some of that food ready for them. But if you've got a bit of dead grouper in your pocket, you can get some very nice close-ups of these beautiful animals. Now, I went on a trip down to the Sudan on Royal Evolution. No, it wasn't Royal Evolution. Beg your pardon. What came after Royal Evolution? Oh, yeah, it was Royal Evolution. So I'm getting around the wrong way. I went on Royal Emperor first, then Royal Evolution still goes down from Egypt down to the Sudan. And I went on Royal Evolution, and everybody on the boat, they were just hyped up about sharks. All they wanted to see was sharks. And every dive, we went diving, and we didn't see any sharks. We went all the way down to the Suakin Islands, and we didn't see any sharks. And we came back, we didn't see any sharks. And I said, well, don't worry. When we get to Shabrumi, we'll see plenty of sharks. So we went in at Shabrumi, and there were no sharks. So I thought, oh, well, you know, when I was dive guiding on the Jenny 5, I used to get about 200 sharks into a shark feed at Shabrumi. So I thought, well, they're not going to come in. They've got to have a reason to come in. So on the next dive we did at Shabrumi, I went in first, and we had half a dozen of these grey reef sharks swimming around. This is shot on film, by the way. And everyone was made up. They got back on the boat. Everyone was so pleased that the sharks, they'd seen sharks and got photographs of sharks. It was great. Everyone was really pleased. And then we did the third dive, and I was the last one in. And everybody saw what I did. Of course, I had a bit of dead fish in my pocket. And when we got back to the boat, they complained to the captain that I'd been feeding the sharks. I didn't actually feed the sharks. I just had a bit of dead fish in my pocket so they could smell it. But they all complained that I'd been feeding the sharks. And I said, well, you know, what do you want? Do you want to see sharks or not see sharks? They're not going to come and look at you because they're interested in your camera. You've got to give them a reason to come. But anyway, that's the nature of it, unfortunately. Sadly, of course, some sharks you see are like this one, dead, because they've been slaughtered either for their fins. This one had been slaughtered merely for its liver. Can you believe it? So it's very sad. This was in the Yemen. Very, very sad that people do this sort of thing. But that's the story of our world, I'm afraid. One of the wrecks I dived on, I don't know if any of you have dived on this. This is a British destroyer in the Red Sea, and that's Emperor Elite was the boat. Now we knew about this wreck, and I went there. Just me and Mike Brown, the manager of Emperor Divers, and his girlfriend or wife now, and who else was there? Can't remember the names now. That dive guide that everyone knows. We went there. Just five of us went to dive this wreck, and it's a very secret wreck of a British destroyer outside a very secret Egyptian naval base, and that's why no one goes there. Because, of course, while we were there, we got arrested. But, you know, that's part of the course. Having been down the whole length of the Red Sea, I've been shot at by Egyptians, I've been shot at by Sudanese, I've been shot at by Eritreans, and I've been arrested by the Yemenis. So, you know, I just knew that's part of the course in those days. But this is more recent. And this is the wreck, and it's only a small wreck. It's a destroyer. What happened was the Egyptians bought it from the Royal Navy, sent it out to India, had it refitted, and they brought it back. And the Israelis said, nah. And they sent half a dozen Phantom jets over and bombed it to pieces. So there it is. So it's lying on the seabed. I don't know. Does anyone dive it now? Does anyone know that wreck? I can't remember. It's called El Kaha is called now, but I can't remember the name of it. What it was when it was a British destroyer. I went to Palau. Where everyone knows this wreck of the seaplane in Palau. This is there. But this was it shot on film on the 15 mil on the Mykonos. And if I go back, that's it shot digitally. Same plane. It's obviously at the time it's the front's fallen off. But it was a bit better condition when I first dived it. But when I was in Palau, I was diving the wrecks in the Palau. They're quite hard. Their visibility is not very good because they're in the lagoon in Palau, but they are warships. And I dived with this guy. His name was Tomimitsu Ishikawa. He was the engineer or chief engineer on the Eero when it was bombed. Can you believe it? And I went diving with him 60 years later when he was nearly 90 years old, and he survived his wreck twice. So that was interesting. I asked him, I said to him, well, I had the girl was translating for me. He didn't speak English, I don't speak Japanese. I said to him, did you have any regrets about being in Palau? What happened? And the translator, the interpreter said to me, of course he has regret. He nearly died. I said, no, I don't mean that. I mean the whole business of why the Japanese Navy was in Palau. Does he have any regrets? And she asked it. She said, I don't understand the question. I said, look, just ask him the question. So she asked him the question. He understood the question. He said, we should have fought harder. That's an interesting insight, isn't it? Now, one day, a publisher approached me and they wanted to do a book. It was a book on how to dive. I've got a copy of it here, book on how to dive, okay? And they wanted it written and illustrated. And I had all the pictures in my library over the years. So they approached me to do this book. Marshall Editions published it. In Britain, it was published. It was published by in Britain. Adelaide Coles, Nautical. But it was published worldwide. And I had to write it in American as well as in English, because obviously Americans, they use cubic feet and stuff like that. Stupid stuff, stupid measurements, feet in inches. And they approached me and asked me to do this book. And because they approached me, I was able to negotiate a decent price. And they paid me to do this book enough money to buy a Volkswagen Golf GTI diesel, not GTI, GTD diesel, which was quite handy. And that was, nice money, worth doing. It took me about 6 weeks to put it together. Now, at the same time, I was great friends with Sam Harwood, who owned at the time Maldives Scuba Tours, and she'd done a book on the Maldives. And this book had been published in 10 languages and was sold everywhere. And all she'd been paid was 500 quid. And I said, well, how come? She said, oh, she was on royalties. I said, yeah, royalties. I didn't negotiate royalties. I negotiated a fee. And that's the trick. They come to you, get a fee. So that's the first thing I'm going to tell you about making money out of diving photographs. Here's a picture of Michelle Cove in the Bahamas. I can't remember why I put this picture in. But you can see that she's a really good model. She knows what to do. We jumped in the water and we did lots of very useful pictures in the space of about 20 minutes because she knows exactly what she's doing as a model. And that is always very useful. Unfortunately, she insisted on wearing the Stuart Cove advertising motifs. This was the Blue Belt in the Sudan. If you've been there, and you'll notice a lot of my pictures have got divers in. These are not competition pictures. These are not pictures that win awards. They're pictures that go in magazines that tell a story, And this is about the Blue Belt, which is loaded with Toyota trucks. You can see they don't last very well. Toyota trucks want to get a bit of salt water on them. And I went to Bikini Atoll. Now this is Fabio Amaral in the wheelhouse of the Nagato. When the Nagato was upright and floating, it's where Yamamoto stood when he got the signal Tora, 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 saying that the raid on Pearl Harbor had been successful. So it's like all big battleships, it's upside down in Bikini Atoll, in Bikini Lagoon. And it's at 55 meters deep. People say, oh, well, you should use Trimix. You couldn't get the helium out there. So what we did was we used air and we decompressed on nitrox 80 because we had oxygen generators to make the nitrox 80. This is the Saratoga and Bikini Atoll. This is probably the world's largest diveable shipwreck that hasn't been intentionally sunk for the benefit of divers. And the Big O in the Gulf of Mexico is bigger, but of course that was sunk intentionally. And this is Fabio in the control room of the Saratoga. So you see, I'm not taking brilliant pictures. I'm just taking pictures that tell a story to go with the article. I got invited to go out to the Galapagos on Galapagos Sky on its initial voyage. Peter Hughes phoned me up. And I said, I'm sorry, Peter, but I can't go that week because I've already been invited to go and dive on the wreck of the Don Pedro in Ibiza. He said, don't be a Burke, come to the Galapagos. I said, no. You know, the Don Pedro in Ibiza, more people are going to dive that from Britain, probably, than go to the Galapagos. Galapagos is a very expensive trip. This wreck is lying outside Ibiza town. And so I felt compelled to go there. I thought it was a good story, you know. It's there, it's lying outside, it's a roll-on, roll-off car ferry. That's one of the two propellers on it. And that's, you know, a scorpion fish, a Mediterranean scorpion fish that was lying on it, sitting on its hull, you know. So it's important to tell the story. Sometimes, of course, you can't plan for what you're going to photograph. I was swimming along in the Red Sea on a very boring dive site on my own. Oh, sorry about that. Don't get me struck off from the VSAC, but I was on my own. Often I'm diving on my own because people get bored with being with me. So they bugger off and I go around and photograph things. And I was swimming along and I just had the sensation that somebody was looking over my shoulder. And I turned around and there was this dugong who swam next to me and gave me opportunity to photograph it. How nice. What a lovely picture of a dugong. But this is the picture of a dugong that has been published more and in fact won some awards in some natural ecology exhibitions that were in London, because this one tells the story. There's the dugong and there's the human race, you know, and that picture was a better journalistic picture than just a nice picture of a dugong. It tells the story. This picture, now, people can't believe this, but I shot this in the ocean. And the guy in the photograph was James Crossley, who was Hunter, the television gladiator. He was having an affair with Ulrika Johnson at the time, and it was spectacularly broken up and it had a lot of publicity. And when he came up after this dive, he said, that was the best experience of my life. And then immediately he said, no, I didn't say that. I deny it. I didn't say that, because he could see a newspaper headline, I'd rather kiss a fish. But of course, this dolphin was one of the dolphin that have been rehabilitated. They, you know, in the Bahamas, they have a place called Sanctuary Bay where they rehabilitate a dolphin that have been in dolphinarium and circuses and so on. But these dolphin have never learned to eat big fish. Wild dolphin eat big fish and regurgitate the bones. These dolphin that have been in dolphinarium have been fed on herring. They've been fed on little fish. Well, a dolphin could never catch enough little fish in the wild to feed itself. So they hang around Sanctuary Bay because they get fed every day. So they're sort of, you go out in the ocean with a dolphin. This one was called Robala, and get great shots. Again, Nikonos 5 15mm lens on the Fuji Chrome, and they pose for you. So what more could you ask, really? But in many ways, I still look at this picture and think, God, that's probably the most satisfying picture I've ever taken underwater. Yeah, you may disagree. But again, you know, it's all about telling the story. This one was Pancho. Pancho, the grouper. He was at El Hierro in the Canary Islands. You know, he was a character. The story I wrote was about Pancho the grouper, and it was important to get the picture to illustrate the story, not to get a picture that told something else. I got to use some very unusual equipment. You know, I got to use one of these Pegasus thrusters, you know, which could send you zooming along at 4 kilometers an hour, but with hands free, so you could still use your camera. And the manufacturers very thoughtfully and with great foresight gave me a thruster of my own, which I took around the world with me. And you know, this is me just trying it for the first time out in Florida, and the guy there is the inventor of the thing. You can see I'm quite a lot taller than he is. Brilliant. I mean, I went round the Spiegel Grove, which we're over there. I swam around the Spiegel Grove in about 10 minutes because you know, I was swimming effortlessly. But of course, my hands were free. And when the battery finally goes flat, you don't even know it's there. You don't notice it while you're in the water. Great bit of kit. And of course, take it out to somewhere like Mount Palau, and you can swim alongside whale sharks. You know, I mean, with scuba kit on. I mean, most people couldn't keep up with a whale shark. They're doing about 5 knots at a gentle pace. But if you're doing 5 knots alongside them, you can get some great close-ups. And it enables you to get places. I mean, I took this in the Maldives. It enables you to get to where you need to go to get the shot, when other people are saying, oh, look, there's a manta over there. If only I wish I was over there. Well, you can get there if you've got something that will send you there on your back. This one, someone mentioned Tupataha. I took this in Tupataha. Again, you know, you've got the agility underwater, which you don't have when you're wearing scuba kit. You're pretty cumbersome, really, otherwise. And it was a great bit of kit. I took this picture in Malpelo. I was there for 10 days in Malpelo. This is a rock in the middle of the Pacific, owned by Colombia, but I went from Panama. And in 10 days, I got one useful picture. This is it, because it took that long to get the moment. Now you'll notice that the shark closest has got some vicious mating scars on its side. The one in the distance is a male, the one close to me is a female. And my wife said to me, why is that shark all chived up like that? I said, well, you know, male sharks are pretty rough. It's not just me. This is one of the last trips I ever did. It might have been the actual last trip. I think things have gone really badly. I was at Tiger Beach photographing the tiger sharks there, and again they just drop a box of bait in the water. They don't actually feed the sharks. The bait's just there to lure them in. And these tiger sharks are a bit sneaky. And while I was photographing this shark, another one of similar size swam up behind me and grabbed my tank and swam off with it. Well, of course, I was attached to my tank, so effectively it swam off with me. And that's quite interesting when you suddenly find yourself hurtling through the water. Luckily, it got bored after about 2 minutes, which is quite a long time actually when you're being attacked by a shark, and it dropped me. But interestingly enough, I went back to where the bait was and to take more pictures, and it did it again. It grabbed me by the tank and swam off with me again. And you know, the other divers on the dive, they didn't want to do a second dive. I don't know why. They all lost their nerve. It's one of those things, I suppose. But you know, you've got to put it this way: diving with tiger sharks is not as dangerous as going to Tesco's at the moment. Put it that way, especially if you're my age. Oh, why have I got this picture? This is another one of these dolphin pictures taken in another time in Sanctuary Bay with a very nice little girl who was friends with dolphin. Again, this was actually taken on a digital camera. I mean, come 2007, I think I swapped over to digital. But I met some interesting characters on these trips as well. I went to Gallipoli. The diving on the wrecks of Gallipoli was non-existent. because all the wrecks had been salvaged. So really, we were just diving on where the wrecks had been. But this, where we're on now, this is the Nusrat, which is the mine layer, which lay the mines, which sunk all the British warships. And the guy in the photograph is called Ian Patterson, and his uncle, sorry, great uncle, let's get it right. His great uncle was General Sir Ian Patterson, who ran the campaign in Gallipoli. And I went with Ian Patterson and to dive the wrecks of Gallipoli. That was quite interesting to meet him. Here's another person I found very interesting. I've become firm friends with Stan here. This is Stan Waterman. Now he was one of the 3 cameramen, underwater cameramen on the Deep. You know, he shot Jacqueline Bisset in the wet t-shirt. And, you know, he's getting on now. When I took this picture of Stan, it was his 80th birthday. And we were at Cocos Island. And we had an 80th birthday party. The lady in the picture, Nancy, was his, I believe, his nursemaid. I imagine that's what she was. Anyway, I was with Stan on this Liverpool, and Stan is he's a really cool guy. I mean, okay, he's a bit frail, 80 years old then, a bit frail on the boat, but in the water, of course, the years slipped away. But back on the boat, these young American divers would give him advice. They would keep giving him advice. And I used to think, for fuck's sake, you know, this guy has been in the water longer than you've been alive. And they would give him advice because he was old. And he would always listen patiently to what they have to say. And then he'd say, good for you. And I've adopted this expression myself now. I say, good for you. Anyway, I was in Cocos. He had his 80th birthday. And then a couple of months later, I was in Rangiroa on the Tahiti Aggressor. And there was Stan Waterman having his 80th birthday. I said, Stan, you had your 80th birthday a couple of months ago. He said, when you get to my age, you can have as many birthdays as you like. And he gave me so many bon mots. It's brilliant. And we came back from a dive at this trip at Alcyon. Now, I was using a closed circuit rebreather. Nobody else was using closed circuit rebreather in those days. So we were at Alcyon, and I was diving quite deep with this rebreather. And I came back to the top of the seamount, which Alcyon is a seamount, and there was Stan surrounded by hammerhead sharks in the current, trying to hold steady on a jawfish. You know, I thought, oh, he's seen enough hammerhead sharks. He's not interested in those. He's bored with hammerheads. He's trying to photograph this jawfish. Swarms of sharks swim around his head. And of course, I had film in those days, so I was out of film because I couldn't get a shot of this. But anyway, I signaled to Stan that maybe we should go up now because all the other divers were back in the boat. And we looked up at where the boat was moored. On an anchor, and we saw the underside of the boat, and we could see these explosions of vomit hitting the water every so often from the boat. We thought, oh, it doesn't look nice up there, because obviously, you know, the divers in the boat were enjoying a bit of a choppy sea. So we went up the line, and Stan had to do a 6-meter stop because he was into deco. I wasn't because I was on closed circuit, but I stayed with him. And we got back to the boat, and because he's 80 years old, I stayed in the water and took his kit from him, and he climbed the ladder, and he looked into the panga, the boat, and he said to me, he looked at all these rather weary-looking divers in various shades of green, and he looked down at me and he said, when you get to my age, it's best to be the last one in the boat. Another good bit of advice. So, other people I've met now. He's a bit of a character. This guy. I taught this guy to dive, and then I taught him to dive in a swimming pool, and then I had to take him out somewhere to get him in the sea. But he would only travel first class, and there aren't many direct destinations you can go to for diving that fly first class. You can go business class, but not many places you can get to first class. But I found there was a direct flight by BA to Barbados. So we went to Barbados, and he went first class with his wife, and I sat in the back of the plane in the cheap seats. And we got there, and we stayed in the hotel. I'll just tell you how expensive this hotel was. We weren't drinking because we were diving. We ate lunch and dinner 6 days running, and the bill was $12,000. Okay, that's the hotel we stayed at in Barbados. It's not for the faint-hearted, that's for sure. Anyway, I took this guy in the water. I haven't told you who he is yet. I took him in the water, and I thought, oh, this is a big responsibility. I don't want to kill him. I better take him somewhere where it's just shallow, where I can walk him into the water to begin with. I don't want him jumping out of a boat and banging his head. So we went along the coast to this bit of beach, and we walked in, and it was boring as hell. There was nothing but sand and mooring blocks, absolutely nothing. I thought, oh my God, he's going to be bored out of his mind, and he's going to be put off diving. But as we were there, and I was swimming along looking at this blank sandy seabed, which obviously wasn't a dive site, 2 green turtles swam along. Oh, brilliant. And they swam right up to us. And this one swam right up to my student and bit him. It made 6 pages in the Mail on Sunday because the person I was teaching to dive was Norman Tebbit. Yes, people said, why didn't you drown him? Actually, Norman Tebbit in those days, I mean, he's lost the plot now, unfortunately, but he was actually okay, I thought, as a human being. I mean, he might have been awful as a politician, but as a human being, he was just he was an Essex boy, you know, a bloke like me. So I got on very well with him. But it was quite funny. And what was interesting was the turtle that bit him was a turtle that locals have been feeding, and they'd named it Arthur. And I thought, how lovely, you know, a turtle called Arthur. It just reminded me of Arthur Scargill and the miners' strike. So that was an interesting little trip. I dived with this bloke. This is Alberto Pelissari. Now, I dived with him. I was diving on scuba, and I photographed him doing these deep free dives. And I was in St. Lucia, and he was demonstrating free diving there. So that was quite fun. But after I'd been diving with Umberto, I still had some few days left. And so I thought I'd go diving, you know, just do some routine dives. And I got a severe bollocking for swimming ahead of the dive guide. I said to her, well, I was photographing you, you know, so I can either photograph your front end or your back end. But if I'm going to photograph your front end, I've got to be ahead of you. She went, you never swim ahead of the dive guide. She said, do you want to continue diving or not? I said, okay, I'll do what you said. And I just carried on, ignored her. And she just got more and more angry over the next couple of days. I put this picture in only because this is a shot in the Maldives. That's Rob Brining in those days, it was the Kima, going ashore to an island with some of the passengers. And what's interesting, if you go to Ocean Leisure in Charing Cross, they've got this picture as a window display. And it's about, I don't know, about 12 feet across. And it gives you an interesting opportunity because I shot it on Fujichrome and I scanned it on a Nikon Cool Scan. And you can go and look at that picture and it's beautiful quality, you know, and you think, well, it shouldn't have been. It should have been awful quality. But it just goes to show, doesn't it, you know, what you can get away with. I remember talking to Kurt Amsler once, and he said Kurt Amsler, in the days of yore, he won every photographic competition back in I suppose it would be the 70s, Swiss photographer. And Kurt Amsler said to me, he scans everything on a Cool Scan, and no problem. Now I hope that my connection hasn't dropped out. I'll carry on. Let's just see. Slow connection. I don't know. Hopefully you can still see this. Somebody... Can you see it still?
Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
I've just got.
We'll
I
clear
did
at the
signal saying it was, I thought my finger dropped out. Yeah, I took this in Tupataha. I was very lucky. I was trying to photograph these jacks, and this turtle came up and swam past me, and that was quite interesting. Apart from the fact that the art director on Diver magazine went to a lot of trouble to retouch out the jacks because he wanted to put copy there instead. Great, just goes to show. But it is, you know, someone posted a picture of this Napoleon wrasse at was it at I'm trying to think where it was. Someone posted, I think it was Simon Rogers, and I had the same fish. That's what I'm trying to say. Simon posted a picture on Facebook of a Napoleon wrasse. I'm trying to think where it was, where photographed in the Maldives, and it's the same fish, exactly the same fish. This is a thing I did on frogfish, and you'll see again giant frogfish. I got the picture over to the right because I used space down the left for the copy, and the same with this, with these cuttlefish. I'm constantly thinking in terms of how the pictures work. This was I dropped in here, and one of my flash guns stopped working. Good old Subtronic, eh? Yeah, stopped working. So I'm lighting it with one flash gun, but I got these two octopus mating, and people said, oh, you know, underwater flashes disturb the animals. Well, these octopus, they mated for about 45 minutes, and I photographed the whole event for 45 minutes, repeatedly taking pictures of. Can't remember why I put this one in. Lionfish. Oh yes, I went out to Papua New Guinea to photograph the rhinopius. It's one of the places where you find these rhinopius, and I went out there, and below me I was with Loloata, where there are a lot of rhinopius around there. They could not find a single rhinopius for the whole week I was there. And I came back, I wrote an article called "The Rhinopius is Missing." Anyway, I went back a couple of years later, and the Japanese girl who'd taken over the dive guide there, it became a matter of honor. So on every dive, you know, she found me a rhinopius. So I've got more rhinopius pictures than you can shake a stick at. Then, of course, a publisher came to me and asked me to write this book, Amazing Diving Stories. And quite frankly, I had all the stories. All I had to do was write it in the third person. So they weren't stories about me, but they're all stories that I'd experienced. So I banged that together. And again, because they'd come to me, I got paid handsomely to do it. And that seems to be the rule. If someone comes to you with a project, you can get a good fee. Finally, I got to 65 years old, and no one had invited me to Truck Lagoon. I said to my wife, I'm never going to go to Truck Lagoon. Let's just bite the bullet. We'll buy a couple of trips. And we spent, you know, mega bucks going to Truck Lagoon. A month before we were due to go, I got an invite. So I went twice in 2 months. That was in the food, or what was that in? That was in the, I can't remember the name of that wreck. That's the one that sank gently, incomplete. But this was the Nippo Maru. This is the Fujikawa. Oh no, this is the Hain Maru. These are submarine periscopes on the Hain Maru. The Fujikawa Maru, gun on the Fujikawa Maru. This is the telegraph on the Shinkoko Maru. And another one, the Shinkoko Maru is actually covered in these telegraph. It's telegraph heaven. The Rio de Janeiro is just full of beer, or empty bottles of beer now, of course. And the star of the show is the San Francisco Maru. Now, it's got this H frame, which is about 30 meters deep, which is a useful point because in depth, because when you go deep, you're about 50, 55 meters deep. My wife and I dived it on air and nitrox. We had twin sets. We just twinned up independent cylinders, and one was air and one was nitrox, so that we could go and do the deepest part of the dive on air, and then come up and at 30 meters swap over to nitrox 36, I think we had. And we were down on this San Francisco Maru. We were inside the hold with all the landmines, and I was saying to her, you know, time to come up, time to come up. And she's going. Later on, we were on the Deco bar, and I don't know whether I've got a picture. No, I haven't got the Deco bar here, sorry. I was on the Deco bar, and she's going to me. So when we finally made it out of Deco onto the back of the boat, I said to her, if you came up when I told you to, we wouldn't have 45 minutes of stops to do. But there we are. That's what you do when you dive with your wife. You go and do a nice dive, and then you come back and have a row on the aft deck of the boat. One of the last trips I did was to with Stuart Cove, one of the last diver magazine trips I did. Stuart Cove said to me that he'd found this place where there were great hammerhead sharks aggregating, and he thought he might be able to feed them. Was I game to come along and have a go? He said it might not work, might work, might not work. So we went to this spot where the few invited, some of his invited guests, people he'd known. There was Lawson Wood came along, but they were mainly Americans, and that guy in the picture is a Canadian. And there's a bit of a current running, so we had this rope just to hold on to. And of course, we had all these nurse sharks swimming around, being a nuisance. But blow me, if there weren't any hammerheads, we'd have been pleased with the nurse sharks. But they were just basically collateral damage. They kept getting in the shot, you know, when we didn't want them to. But you know, you can see that's Beto Barbosa. We called him the master baiter because he was good at baiting the great hammerheads. You can see he's got a bit of dead barracuda in his hand. And the great hammerheads will swim round. And of course, again, we were the first people doing it. We got some great shots, which no one had got before. And within weeks, everybody was there doing it. You know, there are billions of people taking pictures of great hammerheads. So they went from being rarely photographed to commonly photographed. And that's a picture I always like to say of a very dangerous animal swimming with a great hammerhead. So, and that's what happens when you've got a really good wide angle lens, Sigma 15mm on the full frame camera, jammed up against the eyeball of a great hammerhead. You get these rather curious shots that start becoming almost cartoon-like. And of course, the picture that I use, that's not me. That's Fraser Nivens, who used to own the Bahamas Scuba Center years ago. He's now a cameraman. And I took that shot of him, which is used quite a lot. And it's quite a fun shot. It's in my book. Now, I had this great idea. I'll do this book called Shark Bites. And it was my idea. You see, no publisher came to me. I went to a publisher. And you know what? It hasn't really made any money. Because that's what seems to happen. When people come to you and want a picture taken or a book done, you can get good money. When it's your idea, it seems it doesn't work. So there we are. That's my life. That's underwater. And I have never taken a picture that was worthy of winning a competition, but I made quite a good living at it. And there we go. I hope you enjoyed it.